Hello everyone, today we talk about military organization of Hellenistic Sparta. So we're just essentially covering the Spartan history from the beginning, roughly from the Battle of Leuctra actually. So we are in the beginning of the 4th century BC up to the very beginning of the 2nd century BC. So this is not going to be a video on Spartan tactics, nor this is the video about discussing about classical Sparta, as we are essentially in the following period instead, the one of the Spartan decline. So this is kind of also partially strange because in Schwerpunkt I never spoke about classical Sparta, and I will definitely in the future, and I will try to be quite careful about explaining it thoroughly, because I think it's an important chapter. It's at least something that has gained always a certain degree. It's a topic that's always been widely discussed and famed in pop culture. It's like, especially if you think what happens with certain movies or certain, and there are lots of people who are kind of keen on the Spartans, but at the same time you hear lots of things that are not truly correct, and sometimes it's not really a matter of having much detailed knowledge. It's really about getting the essentials right. And the essentials are paradoxically kind of the most difficult things to get right, because the human mind tends to build up prejudices about the essentials in order to explain things, and then when the human mind is confronted with the, say the factual evidence, let's put it in these terms, kind of might say, well, no, this is true, this is not true because it's kind of different from what I thought. But this is not the point, though. And yet it allows me to say now that this terminal phase, let's say, of Spartan independence, we can say, essentially as an independent power and as an independent military, is essentially much more fascinating, at least by a certain extent, than the story of classical Sparta. And it's also less known, because objectively, after Leuctra, you rarely hear about the Spartans in general. Indeed, Sparta had fallen to the rank of second, say in the position of second rank power. This time wasn't much of a military power, and essentially we're discussing now the Hellenistic phase. That is when also classical warfare, and also the classical Hellenistic phalanx, classical Hellenic phalanx had been surpassed by the Hellenistic or Macedonian phalanx, as you wanna. And I will dedicate an excruciatingly wide number of videos to the transition from classical to Hellenistic warfare. Let's say better Hellenic and Hellenistic warfare, because if I say classical now, you maybe gonna take it in the broader sense. From Hellenic specifically to Hellenistic warfare, which is very important, because it was definitely a very crucial passage into Western military history, and not only, actually in the history of military history, of world military history. And it led to certain consequences that were important even for the other main powers that followed. If you think about the Carthaginians, if you think, not just about Alexander and his successors, but also about Rome. But this is not the case. Today we stick to Sparta. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And so I think we don't have to remind what the Battle of Leuctra actually has been, as a major defeat of the Spartans against Thebes, that at that point was experimenting new tactics that kind of managed to mess up, and in this sense to oblige the kind of the decline, or at least a transformation of classical hoplitic warfare. We won't now focus on Leuctra proper. What is important is that Leuctra basically shatters the very fundament, say, same basis of Spartan power in the Peloponnese. So this it was mostly naturally, there was a tactical defeat, but also in the sense a strategical defeat, as Sparta, after Leuctra, couldn't really rise to call on these large forces of allied troops from the rest of the Peloponnesian states that up to that point had been kind of gravitating around a Spartan power. That, albeit not having had an empire, say like Athens, or how you want to call it, Athens. Yeah, that's the real pronunciation. However, had this eminently terrestrial power that was based in the region of the Laconia. And the Spartan military, also in here we would kind of skip the classical period, but I think you kind of less all know that the bulk of the Spartan military was made up by the so-called Spartiatai, that were these essentially minority caste of Spartan citizens that had managed to build over the population of Laconia this kind of rule over the centuries that had segmented the Laconian society in a very very peculiar way, with these Spartans basically at the head of society and the others kind of following, and this had been kind of a weakness for Sparta as well, because there were, generally speaking, in the Spartan army relatively few citizens, and especially at this time this number is seemingly always has however shrunk in massively. I will see later. Then Laconia, so this region of Peloponnese, was populated also by the so-called Helots. They were serfs, say better than slaves, because they, as we will see, they also had a kind of sometimes overlooked importance relative to the Spartan military, that they weren't just servants as camp aides of the Spartiatai, but seemingly also fought as light infantry. And light infantry at this point is also extremely useful not just from a tactical but also strategical point of view, because you can't carry out a campaign without having just with heavy infantry. You can't do everything with heavy infantry. You need light troops that kind of support it in some way and open the path to heavy infantry, and especially at this time, the importance of missile infantry was kind of increasing. Most of all, the idea of having a more mobile infantry force that could sometimes even cause serious problems to the hoplitic phalanx. And this happened for many reasons that now we can't explain. It has to do, however, with the the aforementioned transition from classical from Hellenic warfare to Hellenistic warfare. Let's put it in this way. I'm still not decided where to use classical, because usually I talk about classical warfare as the Hellenic hoplitic warfare in this context of Greek history, but it's for the sake of brevity, because otherwise every time I say classical Hellenic phalanx, I should say something like Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx in opposition. It's kind of too long. That is 6 words altogether. just as an object. So I kind of sometimes try to be more concise, but I reflect on the whether this linguistical choice is appropriate or not to make people understand what I'm talking about. However, at this point, Spartan society is undergoing an important transformation, because the original, say, rigid division between the Spartiatai and the Helots, even at this point, was kind of disappearing. I mean, not fully disappearing, but kind of getting more. The two groups getting a bit mixed up in certain ways. In fact, the same Spartan citizens that, as such, were, the able-bodied males were to serve naturally in the Spartan army as Spartiatai. But the main problem in kind of every society at this point is how well off you could really be, especially in these Hellenic polis. The original function of the citizenship was of a military one. Essentially, even though the Greeks, here the Spartans were the exceptions, but the Greeks in general were not really keen on war, but they had realized it was unavoidable from political life. So when I say political, I really mean it from the perspective of the polis. And after all, the creation of the polis had and their, say, the wave of democratic regimes that had taken over in the 4th century had been based on the idea of the demos, that is the people of the cities, to be able also as a military force to impose itself against any form of tyranny. And more in general, the very origin of the polis have their roots in this very fierce anti-aristocratic ethos. It was emphasized, in fact, by the figure of the hoplite, that was at the same time a peasant, say, wasn't aristocratic, definitely, but that had joined. I mean, these were all originally peasants or burghers that were living in these centers of Greece that were still developing, that joined together to produce an army that, albeit non-aristocratic in warfare, and therefore not in quality, and therefore not professional, was, however, able to counter the aristocratic forces. This is the reason why, for instance, the Hoplites fought on foot, in part because they deemed also cavalry as the symbol of aristocracy in some measure, and they despised it. And cavalry requires training, a key and a certain lifestyle that is definitely the aristocratic one. So this is the standard of the Hellenic hoplites. They were non-professional. They were amateurs of war. And nothing else. And the only exception in this that confirms the rule was Sparta. And Sparta had managed to achieve this by creating a sort of political aristocracy. In a sense, the Spartiatai, in this sense, were the citizens that were, however, maintained as a polis by all these other populations of Laconia, chiefly the Helots, but also, staying in their military might over other surrounding cities, and therefore being kind of maintained by this, and therefore allowing the Spartans, the Spartiatai, to spend in training kind of their war life. So how this had basically transformed itself was that the Spartans, after all, weren't these who knows what. I mean, the Spartans were definitely the best hoplites in the Hellenic world, but I don't know, a Celtic or an Italic or Scythian warrior was definitely a much more impressive thing in terms of individual skills than a Spartan warrior, a Spartan hoplite. The Spartans, however, were the best in the hoplitic tactics simply because they could spend their whole life training into that fashion. And hoplitism, in this sense, was it's difficult to kind of compare in efficacy with the tactics of other peoples, because it was something that, and I can't stress this enough, was something pertaining, you can't say exclusively, to the Hellenic motherland. It was not something that was actually replicated abroad. This is another chapter that I'm extremely strongly opinionated about, and that and I've never heard people getting it right, because modern people are obsessed by kind of technologism and all, the idea that if someone is like a hoplite, it has to fight like a hoplite. No, this is not true. And now I can't make a video about this now, and I'm sorry I'm digressing, but this is important also to make you understand the same nature of Spartan warfare in many ways. However, the real point here is that the Spartans were the best trained hoplites, and the difference that the Spartans actually made into combat was that, and it really gets down to this, if you really want to understand the tactical efficacy of the Spartans, is that they simply carried out the military maneuvers in a faster and more orderly way than the other Greeks. That's it. Then you can say things, the Spartans, for instance, were the only Hellenic hoplites to be trained expressly with swords. This is kind of interesting as well. So the Spartans owned also certain individual prowess, but it wasn't nothing extremely developed also in here compared to the other tribal peoples of Europe. That were much more highly trained in that sense. And after all, also the other Greeks used prominently swords, so even if they weren't trained as professionals, however, you realize that there is some approximation in also to this. And now I've been touching a whole lot of extremely important topics, and I'm sorry I'm kind of skipping them, just hinting at them. I promise I will make a video for each one of them, because they're extremely important to understand. However, this had basically brought the Spartans to rely, so to get to the point I was making, why the Spartiati were so few in Spartan society, is that it was because of this essentially elitism that was inherent to Spartan political culture. It was the idea that the Spartans were the best fighters, and that therefore they were few but good, and that this had to reflect not just on the battlefield but also on the from a political and social point of view. So the Spartans were so rigidly traditionalist that they kind of didn't understand how the situation was transforming like. In fact, if you look at the Battle of Leuctra, essentially what happened to the Spartans is that they were defeated by essentially being hit in their Schwerpunkt, as a matter of fact. If you wonder what Schwerpunkt really means, we will we will explain it sooner or later, as of course Epaminondas understood, the Theban army understood that in order to essentially defeat the Spartans, they had to hit them in what really made their tactics so effective, that is, their speed. The Thebans at this point had grown a lot, in demographically speaking. They had lots of hoplites. They weren't absolutely as well trained as the Spartans, but there were many. So Epaminondas understood that if this mass had been used actually to as a shock force and to attack very quickly the Spartans, even before and in a also rather disorderly way by certain standards. But however, before the Spartans could deploy, so taking out the advantage that normally the Spartans had, so being able to deploy so quickly and orderly, they would have managed to defeat them, and so it was. And this was a resounding defeat, naturally, as you can imagine, into the then Thebes. Naturally, Thebes didn't make a great deal, but Thebes is also important because it partially had certain other military developments that were extremely important, and also in part influenced Macedonia and the eventual development of Philip II's phalanx of pikemen. But this is really for another time. So before we go on this premise, I drink a little once again. Excuse me. So one crucial problem, as we were saying, was the hoplites was being equipped essentially with their own wealth. This is something you find essentially in all kind of egalitarian societies. I mean, the idea that there was a kind of political equality, at least in a certain pool of elected citizens, like one of the Hellenic polis, that had theoretically to provide each own for their own equipment. Now, Greece had been changing a lot in the last few centuries, and great political and social evils had taken place. And after this, like many other times in history, these societies had grown unbalanced from a social point of view. So in the case of Sparta, especially because of these defeats and the general decline and the lack of resources that followed to this, because naturally the Spartan grip was now weaker over the Peloponnese, there had been lots of Spartiati that had grown poorer. So they had been demoted from the full citizenship status. This is also pretty serious business at the time, because they were too poor. And these were called the so-called hypomeiones in Greek, so the kind of the inferior by how the etymology suggests. And while this is pretty also kind of baffling by certain standards, if you think it, that certain helots were helots, how you call them, were given essentially a low grade of Spartan citizenship in return for naturally military service in the phalanx, though they were probably quite kind of divided at the beginning, because that was more of a necessity. It's not that Spartans were so happy of having helots in their army in the phalanx. Naturally, these were called instead neudamodes in Greek. Naturally, this meant that were parts of the helots that essentially underwent the same rigid boyhood training discipline that was had been up to that point reserved just for the Spartan citizens. So these changes are very important because it tells you that at this point the Spartans kind of, in spite of their traditionalism, kind of understand that they have to integrate other elements in the army, because otherwise they would have been too weak in their military, from a military point of view. There were also another component that was a bit more external to Spartan society as such from a political point of view, but it was nevertheless part of the broader Spartan domination, that were the so-called perioikoi. So these were instead essentially the free citizens of the polis of Laconia, over which Sparta had extended, I mean, historically at this point, its control, its influence, at least. So these were essentially political communities that were obliged to provide a military contingent of hoplites, because these were polis just like with their own phalanx like all the others. However, to fight together with the Spartans. And this is interesting because at this point you realize that some of these hoplites were even wealthier than certain Spartan citizens, as we have seen, as some have grown too poor, even just for having for providing their own military equipment for the military service, while these other perioikoi, I mean, some of them, if they could go to battle, it's because they had enough equipment, although they didn't have the famed Spartan Training. So this is very important because it kind of backs a little bit as an explanation what I was talking about before, that hoplitic warfare was based on this mostly sheer equipment sometimes. At this time had grown also lighter for reasons that also in here we can't explain, but that still was sometimes what made the difference together with brute force into hoplitic warfare, as all the Greeks but the Spartans were not really trained. Yeah, there was some kind of maybe some during some festivals were certain competitions and all, but nothing to do with a broad and I mean an intensive collective training like the Spartans carried out. So always bear that in mind. And this also in here doesn't mean the Spartans were superheroes, as we were saying, but here we're talking just by Hellenic standards. A Spartan hoplite was kind of, even individually speaking, was definitely less strong, I don't know, than a Celtic warrior, because that was instead the full, in the barbarian world, in the tribal areas, that was instead the full training as an individual warrior by standard, which in the Spartan case had been already something, had evolved already, because the Spartans weren't tribesmen, were citizens of a polis, and their military might had been affirmed into the Greek motherland because of their collective training abilities that most of the barbarians didn't have. Although also in here we should distinguish, because the term barbarian is naturally very Hellenocentric in many ways. For instance, the Persians had a much higher degree of training, collective training, than the Greeks. This is widely unknown in military history, but people still don't understand it. They want to believe the Greeks were better trained than the Persians. Absolutely false. It's the other way around. So whatever. I don't want to put too much on the table now. So it was evident at this point the number of Spartan hoplites was in steady decline in terms of manpower. So and this was undermining essentially the same Spartan power in general. So the as we've seen, the use of the Neodamodes had been kind of a response to this. In the heyday of Sparta, take for instance the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, the Spartans had fielded 8,000 Spartiatai. That wasn't, other, there were still a contained force. It was, however, the moment of greatest say numerical strength of the Spartan armies. The Perioikoi were at this point, were the at that point at the beginning of 5th century BC were something up to perhaps 20,000 or even more, but roughly around that. So at that time Sparta had enough manpower. At this point, the Spartiatae seemingly were just 1,000. This is so at the time of the Battle of Leuctra, the Spartiatae were just 1,000. Plutarch states that by 250 BC the Spartiatae were only 700. So there was also seemingly a steady decline, also after these kind of attempts to compensate. So a very important indicator of the decline of Spartan society in many ways. In the times after the Battle of Leuctra, how was the Spartan army organized? Because this is what we're going to essentially see today. The Spartan army was divided into 12 locoi. Now the locus, it would be a company size organic unit. I think even in today's Greek army it's called like that because so this was kind of, the company size units are the more dynamic on the field. They are the ones that actually make the in terms of combat, make the more active, the most crucial unit in many ways. We don't really know how many hoplites were present in a single locus. Up to that point, we know that there might have been 150, and this was meant to be essentially one fort. 4 locoi would make up a mora. The mora was a larger unit of roughly 600. So at this point, instead, into this fort between 4th and the 3rd century BC, the locoi seems to have it seems that 3, not 4, but 3 locoi were regarded as the equivalent of an old mora. So this means that perhaps the initial number of 150 per locus of soldiers per locus had risen somewhat. So mathematically, this would have, for 3. For making 600, it would make for each locus 200 hoplites. So, however, it seems that it's also possible that the same size of a mora had actually shrunk, which is also another option. So maybe the number of the hoplites in a single locus remained the same. So just the mora kind of shrank to 450. This is possible as well. However, the overall organization into locoi was kind of remain unchanged as within the same unit, which was in turn subdivided by a Pentecostis, which was literally, it means like it would be 50, but probably it was around 80 probably. It would be a kind of a platoon size, and split in other 2, I think, in turn units called enomotai that were probably a perfect half naturally of them. So these would make up still, roughly 140, 150 hoplites per locus. So the point is, though, that if the Spartiatae, as we've said, were just 1,000 at this point, the original 12 locoi of 150 to 200 hoplites obviously had to be necessarily a larger number than the 1,000. So that other troops had to fill the ranks, or make up other units of these. I mean, these other single loci. So this is how the probably the neo-damodes were integrated to fill the gaps, even though it seems that even the Pomeiones, so the inferiors, so those Spartans that kind of fallen into the rank of citizenship, could have still been used. And this entails naturally maybe also certain that first of all that these units were at least originally separated. I mean the Spartiate, they made up their loci on their own, while the Neo-damodes and the Epoumeiones would have done something else. What I suggest, however, is kind of something important, is also that probably these other two categories were somehow starting to be equipped also partly by the state, or better, given that these were still able to provide some equipment, but maybe this was integrated with something else that was given by the state or something like that. This is, however, this also makes a sort of social of segmentation in the army itself. I mean, probably the Spartiate remained naturally the bulk of these of the loci as terms of equipment and training. These other troops were kind of something slightly different. We know that during the 362 expedition of Agesilaus to Egypt, you know that the Spartan king Agesilaus was sent, or Agesilaus, better in Greek, was sent to Egypt at the head of a mercenary force to aid the king Nectanebo I in his region Teos against the Persians. So by this expedition, we are told essentially that there were enough of the Neo-damodes, so these now politicized helots, let's put it in this way, to send 1,000 Hoplites to Egypt. So we can argue there was enough of them to make up these 12 loci we're talking about. Was how the Spartan phalanx was traditionally made up. And relatively to the perioikoi, we think that these were remained out of the Spartan army as such. I mean, they weren't integrated in any way into the loci. I mean, the perioikoi, as we were saying, were part of the military of other polis, so they were organized in their own fashion, and arguably there was no reason, also no military logic to kind of reframe them in other Spartan formed units, as probably the way they were organized in the local political tribes was already based on also a certain degree of esprit de corps and etc. So that would have been kind of unnecessary. So it's interesting that the Helots were framed into the Spartan army in this sense, because they were instead devoid of such pre-existent political organization, and therefore they could be drawn as essentially manpower to be framed into the even within the same Spartan training and discipline process, let's say. And there is also another thing we have to keep in mind. We're talking about the size of this of the Spartan phalanx, even when talking about the same 12 loci at this point, because the Spartan army at this point was levied on the base of number of ages of years of age. It's easier than it sounds. Basically, the the military age was 20 in Sparta. Mm. So let's assume there was a call up of men for let's say 30 years. What is a 30-year call up? It basically means that you have to add those 30 years to the grade 0, that is 20, the age of 20. So it means a 30-year call up means that the levy of the Spartan army now has to involve all the citizens that are from 20 years old plus up to plus 30. So it would be from all the Spartan citizens, let's say the Spartiatai, from 20 to 50. If it's a 40-year call-up, it's all the citizens from 20 plus 40, so from 20 to 60. So this naturally changed a lot because, like in other military organizations, it was based on age groups. Sometimes also that could also vary relatively to certain. I mean, I don't know, if there was a huge battle that wiped out a part of the population, this also could mean that certain generations were less numerous than others, for instance. But however, this kind of complicates the count of the Spartan organic strength, because the number of citizens, even within the same units, could really vary according to what the years of the levy of the issued levy were. And in this, like in other armies all over the world at this point, really not just stopping to Greece, there was a kind of also age segmentation relatively to the tactical function in combat, because the younger age groups were usually probably more likely equipped. There were certain types of hoplites that, especially at this time, started to come out to make the phalanx more flexible, that were essentially more lightly armored, and these had to exploit the speed conferred by their more light armor and their juvenile, physical agility, let's put it in this way, by running. So also in here, there was this tendency of kind of exploiting the impetus, the momentum, to kind of trying to break the first line of the phalanx with these kind of promachoi, as they were conceived, at least ideally. So these ones that were in front of the line of battle, and that had this to try to shatter because the enemy lines, because the hoplites did charge. You don't have to think the Hoplites as something really monolithical and perfectly ordered. The ideal is often very different from practice. The Hoplitic phalanx, as we were saying before, in the case of the Spartans, was probably, if you really wanted to see the best orderly Hoplitic phalanx at this time, you have to look at the one of the Sparta. But as I was saying also in other, for instance, recently I made a video about the campaign of Marathon, 490 BC, and in there, although it was a strategical analysis, kind of hinted at how the Greeks basically charged the Spartan army at the very first, at the very last, also to vent anxiety and stress and this thing. So it could happen even in an allegedly ordered hoplitic battle, that these formations would kind of get disordered in some way, and that was naturally a weakness, because the whole deal of how hoplite warfare worked was to kind of stick together and remain perfectly. And this was something difficult to do for from amateurs of war, like all the Greeks, but the Spartans. But even here, you see that the Spartans begin to use also this kind of more dynamic type of hoplite that is even meant to charge at a greater speed in order to and the younger ones that have this greater strength, this greater speed were used in this sense. Mostly the speed, because probably mature men are kind of in their 30s are maybe less agile than the one in their 20s, but there's probably more massive also physically speaking. So those were kind of the bulk of the, just like in other armies, like the Roman one. But this speed was very important. It was growing into importance then to exactly for this maneuvering, this evolution in maneuvers. It's a bit like what the Spartans had been defeated by the Thebans, like at Leuctra, exploiting the speed and the mass, so the momentum. And this is important to stress, as this shows that there was a kind of naturally of flexibility in the mindset of the even of the Spartans, who were allegedly the most traditionalistic society out there. For instance, there is a beautiful example in 272 BC that is essentially the march of the Epirot army from Sparta to Argos after the failed attempt to take Sparta by Pyrrhus of Epirus. And the Spartan king Areus basically began to harass the retreating Epirot army using these lightest equipped troops that were essentially harassing the Epirot army along the way. And naturally you need these light troops, and these were seemingly accompanied, so these were probably the youngers, and they were also accompanied by Cretan archers. They were also as light infantry, light missile infantry, and also the royal guard. The royal guard at this time, Sparta had kings, as even in spite of being a polis, it was a monarchy, it was something still democratic, let's say, but it worked with these these kings being chosen, being appointed, and the royal guards of Sparta was seemingly, maybe, we don't really know actually, but there might have been 300 at this point. And this episode against Pyrrhus is very important because eventually these light infantry were wiped out by I think the charge of the Molossian cavalry of the Epirotes, but they inflicted considerable losses, including the Pyrrhus' son Ptolemy that was killed. He was like 23 years old into this action, because Pyrrhus had sent him to allegedly reinforce the detachment's morale. Instead he was killed, and that's by these Spartan troops, and then eventually Pyrrhus wiped this body out. Kind of, we can imagine, also very dramatic. So this adds up to actually to the efficacy, the tactical efficacy of these units, as well as light troops. So the Spartans weren't just, even as the Spartiata, they weren't just these, heavy hoplites all working, sticking together. There were also these kind of more dynamic fighters conceived for these very specific purposes. And I can just make a brief consideration that relatively to this now famous transition between classical to Hellenistic warfare, one prominent feature of this transformation was the dynamicization of the phalanx, the increasing flexibility in some way, and especially through the use of certain detached units from the phalanx proper that were more likely equipped, and we will discuss them maybe later. So it's important in this now fully Hellenistic warfare. Think about the Spartans were fighting against Pyrrhus at this point, so kind of some of the greatest commanders in history, and some of the definitely of the greatest commanders in terms of tactical prowess into the Hellenistic warfare itself. So they needed this kind of more dynamic troops that had been originally, in the classical warfare, something that can say didn't exist, because there were always these kind of slaves and serfs, just like the helots, that kind of gravitated around the phalanx as this support function, but were considered kind of throwaway troops, and nobody cared. That weren't even citizens, so they were not really so important. Although I don't want to stress this too much, because probably their importance, even in the golden age of Hellenic Hoplitic warfare in classical times, probably has been overlooked. Probably was much more dynamism than when we're prone to think when imagining this kind of, in fact, monolithic hoplitic phalanxes. It's, however, they really weren't. But this is not the point. The Spartans had been traditionally not really lacking, but having, however, a few cavalry. By these times, during the battle of the Nemea River in 394 BC, there were just 600 cavalrymen in the Spartan army, and they were generally regarded. Spartan cavalry was really usually regarded as poor in quality, and this. Actually, I'm not an expert about this, but I suggest there was also some cultural factor involved, because actually the Spartiatai themselves, so those who made up the phalanx of therefore foot soldiers, were, however, to provide, because of their wealth, for the horses, their maintenance, and also the arms of cavalry. And so the cavalrymen were kind of substitutes. I think there were some units. I think there at that point, and now I don't really remember. But there were even called hippes, so cavalrymen, that were, however, on foot. And so just making, and why is this? Well, because as we were saying before, Hellenic warfare had grown essentially in opposition to cavalry warfare. At this point, Sparta was still, let's say, the most traditionalist Hellenic power. So the idea of the cavalry in the ancient world was about in the sedentary populations, however, surely not in the steppes, as a cowardly mean, because the idea was that whoever fights on horseback can theoretically flee. Instead you fight on foot, you can't go anywhere. This was really felt much in the tribal world as well. This is also what chariot warfare had really been about. I mean, the chariot, as well as a horse, was meant just to bring the leader, the chieftain, the warrior on the field, just to eventually fight on foot. Naturally, here we're mixing a bit everything, but the concept probably was this one, that the true Spartans didn't need to fight on horseback because that was cowardly. So just the Spartiatai from in pragmatic terms had to provide for the horses because they were wealthy enough to do that for as a civic service, as a military duty, but someone else would ride into battle with those horses. And I don't really know who these guys were, by the way. However, seemingly this Spartan cavalry sucked badly, as most of even of the riders weren't really in Greece there was nothing like feudalism, so at this point these horses were not even, there was no one who actually even practiced cavalry training. Now we'll see, actually in other Greek cities it was a bit different, but even in there they kind of mostly happened with mercenary forces, etc. Here in Sparta sometimes the riders met their horses just at the eve of a campaign. So everybody knows that if you want to be a good cavalryman, you have to have a very special relation with your own horse. You have to know, and you have to know the animals, how it behaves. The animal has to trust you as much as you trust the animal. And these guys instead were just meant to, to mount these horses without having even trained with them. So it's kind of explains why this cavalry wasn't really good. And this system was seen by was kind of obviated by the Spartans, as Xenophon says, by essentially hiring mercenaries, like was happening in the other Hellenic powers. And this was also something kind of for which the Spartans had a sort of cultural distance, because obviously what was the need for a Spartan to raise a mercenary to fight for him? It was something considered something outrageous, but in fact gives you the measure of how Spartan power was declining, and how when things get rough you kind of have to adapt to them. So this kind of weird recruitment of the Spartan cavalry was eventually substituted with a mercenary system, kind of more kind of reasonable to do. As we were saying before, the Spartans were now growing less influential in the Hellenic world. So this time, the usual amount of allies that the Spartans managed to call up, to mobilize, was generally lower. However, there was still some prestige Sparta maintained, and were allies fighting, for instance, in the uprising along the Spartans in the uprising against Macedon in 330 BC. This is important because basically the Spartans had taken the chance to rebel. At this time, the Macedonians had kind of now put Greece under their own, kind of trying to make Greece a client state, and they the Spartans rose at this point, and here there were allies joining with Sparta, and at this point, however, should be also considered a bit more the political context, and that because there was a common interest to kind of get rid of the Macedons, it wouldn't happen. And on this occasion, it's interesting to stress that this was done under Agis the third, as the king of Sparta. And this is how the allies were joining him. At this point, the in the Balkans was the Macedonian general Antipater that was fighting in Thrace, and when knew of the threat, was kind of marched south to meet the Spartans. And Diodorus states that the rebelling Greeks had something around 20,000 men, and most of these were from the north, naturally in the Peloponnese, while Antipater had definitely more troops, and eventually there would be the Battle of Megalopolis. It was a kind of surely a defeat. Eventually they had to retreat. It was a very intense fight, and the Spartans suffered very heavy casualties also in here, but just for saying that there were substantial numbers. As a matter of fact, this is interesting, that at that time Agius III had been subsidized by the Persians. So if you wonder why the Spartans could put up this number of 20,000 infantrymen and even 2,000 horse, well, just know that 10,000 of these were actually mercenaries, and nothing but Hellenic mercenaries from the Battle of Issus that had been fought just in a few years before. So, and into which, in fact, the Greek Hoplites had been kind of the most difficult nut to crack for the Macedonians. So here, you usually see the Sparta and a few great military enterprises were organized by Sparta because it was backed by some other power. And in here, you find so many mercenaries that kind of explain that in part. So it's not that Sparta could field at this point so many troops without help. Also because it's really a matter of resources. Sparta didn't control a lot of resources at this point. However, it was neither this completely third category power. It was still something that could put up through these means, however, substantial armies. However, the decline, especially in Spartan manpower, is something that was evidently becoming too serious, as evidently was also a problem of replenishment, simply a lack of manpower. So the Spartans, by the second half of the 3rd century BC, at least certain kings, Spartan kings, try to enforce, to make certain reforms of that were chiefly political and social, but in this sense were meant, however, to have an effect on the military organization. The first attempt was in 242 BC, when King Agius IV proposed a reform which implied the redistribution of the land. This was societies at the time. It was really the issue here, how wealth was distributed, and therefore how the land was, as the land was the base of individual wealth. So this reform had essentially to create new plots to field for, say, fielding 4,500 Spartan hoplites, and this is interesting, 15,000 perioikoi. This is interesting because it kind of entails, so you have to understand the land now was held by people who didn't want to give it. So in fact this reform failed, but it's kind of, you kind of understand where this was going. I mean, the problem there was manpower. There had been serious imbalancements in the distribution of wealth. The only way you could make a functional phalanx once again was to redistribute the land so that these citizens could finally have once again enough per capita wealth to provide their own equipment. But what is mostly interesting is also these 15,000 perioikoi, as and even foreigners. It is that could be given Spartan land essentially for military service. The Spartan army would have had to be organized according to this reform into 15 units of between 200 and 400 men. So this gives you also probably the dimension of the when you have an hoplitic phalanx, you really have to have this deep, solid formations. So when the numbers kind of start to narrow down, the problem is that you don't have a very deep phalanx, and so the aim of this reform was also giving probably more depth to the phalanx, to have more consistent bodies of phalanges that could carry out the famous othismos, or however it is collective push, however it could be achieved, because we will see now another thing it's rarely conceived. And now the Spartans were thinking about transforming their hoplitic, let's say their classical hoplitic army into an Hellenistic one of pikemen, just like the Macedonians were doing. So two things work really in different ways, because for instance, the hoplitic phalanx, the classical hoplitic phalanx, has the othismos, so these guys pushing one against the other, to like in a football match. While the Hellenistic phalanx of pikemen really works in a different fashion. So what I mostly, however, see how interesting is the involvement, the engagement, the participation of perioikoi and even other foreigners. So individuals that up to that point had no role into Spartan politics. So this was a very radical reform. You have to understand it also now. They were naturally very you should understand the political context, but we don't have time for this. But however, it was something like something mind-blowing, especially for the Spartan aristocracy, etc. In fact, the king Agis was assassinated before he could carry out this reform. And Agis had stated that this reform was naturally as it was meant to basically repristinate the old costumes of the Spartan army. So it was something, naturally for the others, this was a kind of a social revolution, so that they kind of put Agis down immediately. But it's still meaningful that, however, it was there was someone in Sparta who had the courage, let's put it in this way, aside from personal interest, to carry out such a radical reform, understanding that that was really the problem. It was really about the problem of having citizens who could be well off to participate to the army in a functional way, to make it a functional military. However, it was 15 years later that the king Cleomenes the third carried out a similar reform to one Agis had proposed, and this was meant to also in here to restore the old Spartan training and discipline. So this thing for which Sparta had been so famous and glorious in the past, and which, by the way, tells us that this was evidently lacking at this point. So this is also a very interesting indicator, because indeed, if you don't have a functional army, if you don't have a functional society, you can't have a collective commitment for training and discipline, and therefore also the same quality of the military is gonna go down. And Cleomenes managed to grant the Spartan citizenship to up to 4,000 perioikoi. This was extremely important in my opinion, also because the new Spartan, the reformed Spartan army now was issued with the Macedonian sarissa. The sarissa would be the Macedonian pike. So in here, we don't just see a merely, you have to think these reforms are usually first political and social, then the military. I mean, yeah, they are aimed, if you want to naturally change how things work, but probably you have to think that armies kind of evolve by themselves. They don't really need a reform to, the reform can sanction something that's already changed. So Cleomenes' reform is important because not only it extended the Spartan citizenship to other people that could, in this sense, and fitting people. I mean, citizens that had enough wealth, even among these perioikoi, to serve the Spartan army effectively, but also to rearrange the tactical, the tactics of the phalanx into a more modern model. That was the Macedonian one. So also tactical need. So yeah, the Spartans did use the pikes, just like the Macedonians did at this point. Actually, we don't really know how many of them were equipped in such a fashion, but I find to be extremely important, however, these number of 4,000 perioikoi, as it's renowned that the Macedonian style phalanx had to work essentially with lots of troops. I mean, you don't in range of thousands, so you don't really that is very important because that's what makes eventually effectively the efficacy of that formation. It's like if you even if we're talking about very different type of phalanx, but even in this, the essentials kind of remain the same. Think about the late medieval phalanx of pikemen. I mean, the Renaissance squares of pikes. Those could work only if there were thousands of troops in there, because that's what made it effective, made it this kind of even there is also a dimensional spatial problem. The phalanx has this main problem of getting outflanked, and once that happens, it immediately melts away, essentially. So even having a very wide front of these troops that were, however, always integrated by other kind of infantry, as we will see, was, however, very important. And the same Cleomenes, in fact, added later. This reform was carried out in 227 BC. Later, Cleomenes added other to these citizens that could participate to the phalanx, 2,000 freed helots, also equipped with the sarissai. So you had essentially in the Spartan army 6,000 pikemen now, more. This is very important in the history of Hellenistic warfare, because now we know that Macedonia, Macedon, as you want to call it, Macedon and the successors of Alexander kind of standardly used the Macedonian style phalanx of pikemen. Actually, not all of them. For instance, the Hoplites didn't really, and this has to be explained actually in the availability of resources. It's not that never think that someone I don't know, Philip II of Macedon one day woke up and said, oh, let's start to equip our soldiers with pikes instead than legs. It doesn't really it didn't really work like that. These were, again, I can't tell about this nowadays, where I will, if I will be still alive in some measure, to talk at least about this. Surely, I mean, not at least, I will do it, because I want to do it. I think it's one of my big guns options. How that transition from the hoplite lance to the pike actually, to the hoplite spear to the pike actually happened. It was a matter of resources. The phalanx of pikemen was enormously expensive. Like just even to build spears that were longer than the average required an extremely complicated way of making them. It took a lot of time. So it implied a state that was very centralized. This was difficult to find in the Greek city-states. Especially in terms of sheer amount of resources. Just Macedon, especially when they conquered the gold and silver mines of Thrace, they finally had enough money to build other things, including, for instance, having functional and professional siege machinery. To have artillery, because it's true that it was the Greeks who seemingly, especially in Syracuse, that it's not surprisingly not, however, into the Greek motherland. So that also, this is also a matter of mindset, but also political and social differentiation. As always remember that the Greek polis that were out of Greece, even as naturally as the Hellenic colonies, but weren't at all like the polis that were in Greece. They were completely different. And that's why also partly Hellenism kind of took over as in terms of military culture in there. However, this is all the more meaningful because not all the Greek it was let's say it better. It was an exception for the Greek city-states at this point in the 3rd century to adapt to the Macedonian style phalanx. It really didn't happen often. It was nothing even so rare, but first of all, you have to think most of the cases we don't even know, because the informations we have from sources now are extremely scanty. So it's difficult even to retrace. We are in the ancient world. We don't have a big deal of information, and here we're talking even some of the best documented areas of the world. But it's very important for understanding how Hellenic society was transforming. And I find it extremely meaningful in the case of Sparta that this power that had been the most rigidly traditionalist at this point and is transitioning directly from the classical political phalanx that especially in Sparta had remained seemingly unchanged in essentials, where no other tactical experimentations had really existed. For instance, the Spartans seemingly never organized bodies of Turriophoroi. That now we will also have to explain what the Turriophoroi are. I will also hear in more detail into another video, but let's say that other Greek city-states had been kind of more trying to make their phalanx more flexible in some ways. Even the think about Iphicrates and how this progressive lightening of the hoplite armor and the lengthening of the hoplite spear had even partly inspired Philip II's reforms in Macedon. Well, the Spartans had remained more or less the same at this point, and instead, differently from many other Greeks, they immediately transitioned to the Macedonian style phalanx model. This is kind of very, very interesting, and not just for the thing in itself, conceptually speaking, which is still remarkable for these theoretical cultural limitations the Spartans allegedly must have had at that point, and that they were able to overcome, telling you how devastated Spartan society really was at this point, to kind of discuss even what had been their past. It's difficult to do, really, but also because it shows that Sparta at this point had kind of the resources still to organize something like a Macedonian style phalanx. And I suspect that the Spartan military developments at this point are kind of overlooked, because we say, oh well, yeah, now the Spartans were kind of doing that, but they didn't have any shot. Eventually they they didn't they didn't win any major battle. They were often depending on the backing of other external powers. But if you realize what, however, internally were able to do at this point, and even if you give a look a bit of the numbers, you see that Sparta, after all, was transforming into kind of an Hellenistic power, at least from a strictly military point of view, in tactics, I mean, and kind of succeeding to make this thing a structural change. For instance, in Athens, we have no evidence of this at all. And Athens had been kind of more open to change in the past, had also pioneered parts of the Turriophoroi things, and the Turriophoroi, not just to make it clear, were certain, at least in Greece proper, because the Greeks called Turriophoroi also other barbarian troops, etc. But in Greece this was slightly different, as the barbarian Tureos was a shield, was actually different from the one used, the same Tureos used by the Greeks, was seemingly smaller, etc. The Tureos was essentially, Turriophoroi were kind of, are even difficult to define, because also in here there is a kind of a segmentation here. There were kind of elite Turriophoroi, kind of most of the Turriophoroi instead were kind of throwaway troops, just used, it was essentially light infantry. Something halfway sometimes between an hoplite phalanx and skirmishers, as they could really fight both in close order and in scattered formation. And they were crucial, especially on those terrains that especially on mountain passes, etc., were extremely dangerous for hoplites to cross, in this sense, because they couldn't pass it in the hoplite formation, so they were kind of exposed to individually to the fire of these troops. And they were actually in the rest of the Hellenistic world mostly mercenaries and barbarian troops, because the Turriophoroi, in this sense, the Turriophorus indicates a guy who basically fights with his light shield and javelins and spear. So this is kind of the standard you could find in the ancient world as the average soldier, the average warrior, say. However, in the case of Greece proper, and this was the case naturally of this barbarian Turriophoroi, was mostly a case of empires like the one of the Seleucids, was plenty of these kind of populations who fought in this fashion, etc. The Macedonian used usually the other populations, Danubian mercenaries, etc. In Greece, where these kind of manpower didn't really exist, you could hire foreign Turriophoroi as well, but the certain Greek city-states had began to develop their own kind of I think it might have been even citizens at that point. Well, Sparta was similarly not interested. It was mostly interested in they recruited Turriophoroi as well, but they didn't institute their own Spartan unit of Turriophoroi. But they were mostly interested in replicating now the Macedonian phalanx, and this is very interesting, in my opinion. Even giving the numbers, for instance, at the Battle of Sellasia, the Spartans had a total of 10,000. Now, Sellasia was a battle fought by the Spartans against Macedon and the Achaean League combined. Now, the Achaean League now was a major competitor of Sparta. Eventually, Sparta was absorbed by the Achaean League. The Spartans were defeated. So you also here these big pitched battles were kind of rare, but they're kind of good indicators of what the military qualities sometimes of the armies were. Not always like that. It's not that everyone who loses is necessarily inferior, but there's still something that probably didn't work right for some reason that has to be investigated. Well, Plutarch states that at this point, out of the total 20,000 troops, there were 6,000 Spartans fighting. at Sellasia. So not bad at all, considering that 150 years before the Spartans were only 1,000 as such. So still a minority, as you can understand. We're roughly a bit less than 1/3 of the total troops, but still 6,000. So the Spartan reforms at this point, it kind of managed to bring out, to make manpower consistently available at them. The mercenaries of this total was 5,000. They were mostly infantry, whereas there were similarly 1,000 mercenary cavalry as well, and 8,000 perioikoi as well. So I believe that in the 6,000 Spartans, probably those, I don't know, I might be mistaken now, because I don't realize whether these 8,000 perioikoi were the ones that were integrated by the reforms. There are even more, like they're of Cleomenes reforms, I mean, and so they're that integrated only 4,000. Or whether there were other perioikoi also in the 6,000 Spartans were counted now at Sellasia. It's probable though that these 8,000 perioikoi were still how do you say that, full perioikoi, in the sense that we're part of these traditional hoplitic phalanxes of the various towns of Laconia. Nevertheless, it's kind of interesting. If you add up the number of Spartans in the perioikoi, you have in fact 14,000 troops of, let's say, the Spartan Commonwealth, as you want to call it in this way. And it's not a few. 14,000 for a single city-state in this sense, with the next, allied polis, but in particular way we have seen what the perioikoi were about. It's not truly a few. And even the fact that they faced an enemy that was telling the truth, much larger. By the way, I'm not sure even about the 1,000 cavalry. Somewhere else from the Spartan side, and somewhere else I found 650 as an estimate. But I mean, these were roughly 20,000 Spartan infantry and 615 cavalry. I mean, Spartan meaning from the Spartan side, and against 28,000 infantry and 1,200 cavalry, more or less, of Macedon and the Achaean League combined. So what Sparta was fielding now, albeit being defeated, was actually a pretty big amount of troops. And you might have questioned, what if Sparta had won at Sellasia? Well, who knows? Naturally wasn't going to rise once again as what it had been before, but it's still remarkable that this was accomplished by, the Sparta had arrived that far, instead of completely collapsing and crumbling on itself. So at this battle, however, we should point out that Cleomenes III, we've seen it would not just reform the army but also commanded the Spartan forces at Sellasia, had been substantially backed by Egypt. The Ptolemies at this time were kind of anti-Macedon, so they would naturally back the Spartans against the Macedonians and their allies. So it's important, however, because in spite of this kind of dependency, and the Sparta made also a big effort on its own, So there was even a sort of political will to go out there and risk it. And this is not a few. It's not just a passive attitude. Kind of the Spartans in this sense remained a bit more, let's try to act a bit like, and first of all, as a single polis, if you think about it. Now, the Achaean League, the Achaean League were all this. Even Epirus had transformed into a league at this point. There were this kind of arrangements into these alliances into the Hellenic world at this time that were also not very. Yeah, they had a kind of weakness because they naturally had this sort of weakness in the unity of command. It was all cities put together with lots of interests, mostly fielded, and Sparta instead remained alone, kind of a loner, and still probably thought it could rely on its own forces, and it's kind of remarkable. At Salasia, the Spartans had, relatively to the mercenaries now, which is also important to stress, is that this 5,000 mercenary infantry was probably all light infantry, as it was the average really at the time. There was probably most of them were Turrentine as well, and it is not entirely bad in the sense that they had their own tactical functions, and this light and dynamic type of troops is observable in the rest of the mercenary forces the Spartans fielded at that point, and that were Tarantino Cavalry and Cretan archers. Now, Tarantino Cavalry was this kind of it emerged from Taras, that, by the way, originally in southern Italy, that was originally a Spartan colony, by the way. But when you read Tarantino Cavalry at this point, they probably had nothing to do with Taras. They were just a type of cavalry at this point, so it was just a way they were equipped, and you could find it literally everywhere in the up to this point, because eventually Tarantino Cavalry also kind of disappears as a kind of troop, or at least it was called in other ways afterwards. So, however, there was light cavalry of skirmishers, so perfect to carry out these hit-and-run tactics and screen operations and harassing the enemy, etc. And the Cretan archers, that were kind of this standard archer type in Greece, as the Cretan archers were really prized at the time. The Macedonians also made extensive use of Cretan archers. Practically were Cretan archers in all Macedonian armies. So this is kind of a bit standard as well. But you see, this meant the Spartans came a long way from the original monolithic hoplitic phalanx. They basically classical phalanx. They transitioned to essentially to a Macedonian style phalanx plus light mercenaries of various kind. So this is a fully Hellenistic army now. And it would be interesting to have known more about this power, about this army. Sorry, at this time. So with the Battle of Salasia, the Spartan, up to this point, Sparta had been declining. Now it's just in its terminal phase. However, the phalanx of Spartan citizens keeps to fight under the so-called tyrants that now took over. Also, this is important as a form of government, because this is also an additional evidence of how Hellenistic this polis was going. You know that many democratic regimes in the Hellenistic times transformed themselves into tyrannies. The tyrant was not a contemporary term. Yeah, at the time, naturally, if you were democratic, you would have thought like that. But this tyrant was actually an office proper. He had not a negative connotation like it has today. Naturally, these were kind of monarchs in fashion, and in this sense, Sparta fully transforms into a Hellenistic tyranny. Also in here, naturally, Silesia had been a very heavy blow. This has changed a lot, etc., and kind of accelerated the transformation and the turn of the Spartan regime. These Hellenistic, these Spartan phalanx after Silesia is still fighting in the Macedonian style. And interestingly, at this point, those subdivisions between the Spartiatae, the Perioikoi, the Helots that had transformed, it kind of finishes, because seemingly the citizenry at this point had kind of been pretty much homogeneous for everybody. I mean, the whole situation had collapsed. The only thing that was cared about, that you were a citizen at this point by name, and then we were hired into the phalanx, and probably also given your own military equipment. I mean, you didn't have to pay it for yourself. This is we haven't said this actually, that in order to field Macedonian style phalanx of pikes, in this sense you need a lot of we hinted at before, but just for Macedon, but this is important also for understanding transformation of Sparta, that you need a freaking lot of resources that the citizens most likely are not going to have. So in spite of the reforms that definitely helped in part, probably it was in parallel a strengthening of the state. I mean, even the other Hellenistic empires gave these kind of plots of lands for the soldiers of the phalanx that had theoretically make these guys grant a living, but most of the equipment actually was now produced and issued and distributed by the state, which implies a greater power of the state, so a greater centralization that here in this sense doesn't surprise to us, has become a tyranny. So as something that has a few to do with the democracy, that tends to want not to pay many taxes, not to have a central direction, a central administration. It's too expensive. Reason for which other Greek city-states normally didn't have this Hellenistic phalanx of pikemen, but preferred just to pay in money, in cash, and to hire mercenaries. Usually the Greek city-states at this point were kind of under the Macedonian influence, and then when the Macedonians asked for them to military help, these guys didn't even send troops anymore. They just sent money, and then the Macedonians would simply hire whatever they wanted. So even the military service in here was something very much in decline, and I suspect that the Spartan reforms, also with the redistribution of the land, etc., were not enough to recreate, and this was also probably what the political from the hypocrisy from the political propaganda was, to recreate the older times where the Spartan citizens had each one their own land and could provide their own equipment. It was giving land as a political measure, as saying, I grant you land to live in there, but you're tied to me as a ruler, and I, however, equip you. You don't make up a sort of monad on your own. So the homogenization of the Spartan phalanx after Silesia just tells us that probably these citizens were all equally poor, and this, naturally is an approximation, but it kind of gave the idea. And now, when the state needed to levy an army, it basically paid almost everything for it. This is my suggestion, at least, because it's how it happened basically also in the other Hellenistic powers, and it's how it would happen for Rome, where even in there the crisis of the recruitment system would take place. So it's kind of, we've seen it all before, and not just in ancient times, by the way. Um, there was also in this last phase of Spartan independence a reliance on mercenaries, a more direct reliance of mercenaries from the side of the tyrants. This is also typical of the Hellenistic tyrannies, as the tyrants didn't want to have an armed demos, so they would rely more favorably on mercenaries that were more faithful to the single ruler, at least up to a certain point. And also partly because this was somehow more convenient, together with a certain amount of pikemen, to have still other professionals of wars, and not also to have a single army, in the sense that the phalanx necessarily needs at this point troops that shield her flanks, for instance, or screen it, to have cavalry, etc. The king Machanidas in 207, at the Battle of Mantinea, it was fought between Sparta and the Achaean League, fielded essentially only mercenaries, so preferring them to the phalanx of citizens. It's quite meaningful. Also in here we still find the Cretans and the Tarentines. There were evidently this kind of very very valid tactical options as light troops, and together with still larger bodies of light infantrymen, as the rest of mercenary infantry made the bulk of the force. Sparta also fought in 195 BC against Rome. This is called normally the war against Nabis. It was actually a broad, seemingly a large encounter. At this point, it was quite interesting. It was a fight between Sparta, Argos, and the Doric Cretans against a larger coalition made up by Rome, the Achaean League, Pergamon, Macedon, and Rhodes. And this is after this, the Spartans were. This was the moment in which basically Sparta lose all its power, and most of its Laconian coastal cities especially enter to be part of the Achaean League, and eventually the same Sparta gets absorbed. Now we don't get it much into detail, but the war against Nabis is kind of interesting, and we might discuss it another time. But relatively to the composition of the Spartan army, here we find instead a citizen levy of 10,000. This is important because it was a kind of a desperate situation for Sparta, so these forces were needed. 3,000 mercenaries, actually 4,000 mercenaries. There were 2,000 phalanges from Argos, and 2,000 Cretans as well. This is pretty large now. So actually, this campaign, the Spartans put up a pretty large army by themselves, and at this point, the Spartan king's bodyguard was made up by mercenaries as well. So this tells you perfectly what kind of political orientation had taken over into Sparta as a tyranny. So something inconceivable in democratic times. And this, however, still failed, but it's still amazing, especially this last series of troops, because it's not really a few, and this were fielded essentially by the roughly by Sparta herself. Yeah, of course, we have seen there were other minor powers with her, but still, especially the 10,000 citizens, kind of not a very few. However, Sparta now kind of ceased to carry out her own independent politics. So this is more or less what I wanted to talk about, and I think it's very interesting even to look at these minor powers into the Hellenistic world, because we say, oh well, now Sparta was declined. Yeah, but there are surely some interesting things it still did, and it's also a relatively well documented power this time, as for others we don't know really much. Paradoxically, we know much less about Hellenistic warfare than classical warfare, and this is due to political and social changes. As in classical times there were free citizens riding. In the Hellenistic times there were mostly subjects, and the subjects didn't really write, also because they were on average poorer, so also history was written in other ways. But Sparta remains probably also here with contact with also with the Romans eventually, the involvement kind of remains well documented. I don't know, I would like maybe to see why this was the case. We still know a relatively few, but what we know is still pretty meaningful to draw an evolution of what happened in Sparta at this point. So for now, as was said before many times, I touched many topics that are very, very important in my opinion, and that I couldn't explain, but I will do it in the future in some way. So don't worry about that. Sooner or later we'll get to this. Just for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.